Now that we have the text in place, the next thing that we need to do is get those 3 custom buttons to appear within our HTML document. Let's just come back to Photoshop for just a minute. I'm talking about these 3 buttons right here. Now, we looked at these buttons earlier when we were evaluating what could be reproduced with CSS and what could not be reproduced. We decided that we could create this border, the text shadow, and the box shadow effects all could be achieved using CSS. It was the background pattern that we couldn't essentially recreate with CSS, so we exported out an image. We created an image called button.png, which contains the upstate and the overstate. What we're going to do in this movie is look at how we can implement using that image to generate these 3 buttons. So let's come back to our HTML editors. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to add the necessary HTML to generate those buttons. Now, those buttons will be contained within the excerpt div element, so make sure that you're inside of that div element and add a new paragraph rule. This paragraph rule, however, will use a class named buttons. So go ahead and type that in. After doing that, you want to make sure to close that tag off. We need to add 3 anchor elements that will ultimately become our button. So what we want to do here is go ahead and type in href. So we have a temporary hyperlink reference. We're just going to type in a £. We'll do the same thing for title. Again, these 2 attributes are really necessary to create a hyperlink. If you're working in a real-world situation, you would plug in the hyperlink and the title for these links. But for now, we're just going to use these £. After doing that, we're also going to attach a class, and this class is going to be btn. Now, don't be confused. If you have code hinting, btt may show up. That's part of the F2FW framework, and that's going to give you very different results. So make sure you're typing in btn. Then you want to close off that anchor element, and we want to add the text of these 3 buttons. If we come back into Photoshop for a second, you'll see that we have learn from it, read more, and grab the file. So that's the text that we want to use within the anchor tags. So I'm going to go ahead and type in learn from it. And to save a little bit of time, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this code that we created here, Control-C or Command-C if you're on a Macintosh, and paste it, Control-V or Command-V if you're on a Mac. And let's just go ahead and update this text. Remember, the middle button will read more. So we'll go ahead and type that in, and then we'll paste our code one more time. That last button, of course, has a label of grab the file. So go ahead and add that. So I think we're all set here in terms of the HTML structure. Go ahead and save this document, and what we want to do now is return back to style.css. The first thing that we want to do in the style sheet file is we want to disable the button margin of the paragraph. So we need to do that, and then we need to add a little bit of space between the buttons. So we're going to come up with some pretty specific selectors here. We're going to go ahead and type in hello p.buttons. And then inside of this selector, we're going to go ahead and set the margin property to 0. We're going to do something very similar for the anchor elements after it follows the p.buttons class. So we're going to go ahead and copy this selector, and then we're going to paste it, and we're just going to go ahead and add the anchor element, and we're going to update these margins. Actually, we want the 0 for the top. We want 20 pixels on the right, 0 pixels on the bottom, and 0 pixels on the left. So that should help out in terms of spacing. What we want to do next is generate the font family we want the label to appear in, the text shadow, the buttons shadow, and also the border. So it's going to require a little bit of coding. So we're going to come down here and write a little less specific selector. It's just going to be anchor.btn. So we'll have the ability to really create buttons wherever we need them. After doing that, we have to type in the background property. Now the background property is going to point to that button file we created earlier. So if you go ahead and type in URL, you may have an editor that gives you the ability to browse your system files. If that's the case, you want to go into Includes, go into Images, and you'll find button.png. Go ahead and click OK. You'll notice it creates that URL for you. After doing that, we want to specify the repeat. We're going to go ahead and type in repeat X, so it only repeats horizontally. And then we want to align this to the top and the left. All right, that's good. After doing that, what we want to do is create the box shadow. Now, the box shadow is an experimental property. So we'll go ahead and type in box shadow, and we'll type in 0, 0, 3 pixels, and then we want a color of CCC. Now, this shorthand notation is just fine, but not all browsers can read box shadow just yet. So what we want to do above it is add a couple more declarations here for box shadow. But what we want to do is we want to use vendor prefixes. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this twice. And up here towards the top, we're going to add the WebKit vendor prefix. So I'll go ahead and type that in. And we also want to add the Mozilla vendor prefix. Probably not a bad idea, in all honesty, to also add the Opera vendor prefix. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this one more time and just change this to an O. Okay, so that just about wraps up the box shadow. What we want to deal with next is the border. I'm going to go ahead and press Enter here a couple times for no other reason than to get the text up here towards the middle of the screen so it's a little bit easier for you to read. So after the box shadow, we want to go ahead and add the border. So go ahead and type in border. We want the border to be 1 pixel, and we want it to be solid, and we want it to be a hex color of 90C8D4. All right, go ahead and type in a semicolon to terminate that. After adding the border, we're going to add a little bit of padding. So we're going to go ahead and add 4 pixels and 10 pixels. So that looks good. And again, if any of this shorthand notation isn't making sense to you, I do explain it in much greater detail in some of our other CSS courses here on the website. So after the padding, we want to establish the appearance of the font. So we're going to use the font property. And the first thing that we're going to do here for the font is we're going to set its appearance to bold. After setting it to bold, we want to set the size to 14 pixels, and we want to have 21 pixels of line height or leading. And then we want to set the font family. So go ahead and create a font stack. I'm going to use Arial, Helvetica, and Sans Serif. After setting the font, we want to set the text shadow property. So go ahead and type in text shadow. And for the text shadow, we're going to go with 0, 1 pixel, 0 pound FFF. Then we want to set the text decoration to none. The reason why we're doing that is because we don't want to see an underline for our hyperlinks. And the final thing that we're going to do is we're going to set the color. And this is going to be the color of the text. The color of the text is going to be pound 5E9BA8. All right. So that will create the button for us in terms of its appearance. But remember, we also have the overstate. So we want to create the hover pseudo selector. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come over here and type in a.btn:/hover. And when the end user mouses over the button, we want to change the background position. So go ahead and type in background-position. And we want to change that to bottom right. And if that doesn't make sense, you want to take a look at the image that we created. Remember, I'll just open up the Files panel here to illustrate that. In fact, I could even come over to the Assets. You'll see the button.png file is very hard to see, but we have a repeating pattern here. And we're initially aligning it to the top left, so we're seeing the top portion of this pattern. And when you hover over it, we want to see the bottom right, so you're seeing the lower portion of this pattern. So again, hopefully that makes sense. The only other thing that we want to do is change the color of the text. So I'll go ahead and type in color pound 3B636B, so a darker blue. So I think we're in pretty good shape here. If you go ahead and save the CSS file, you can come back to the index page, make sure all your documents are saved, go ahead and test it in Chrome or Safari, and when you do, the buttons should appear. It should have that textured image background, and when you mouse over it, you should see the darker portion of the background, and you should see the darker text. Again, the advantage of using one bitmap here and just controlling its position through CSS, you're essentially requesting only one file, so you're making fewer requests to the server, which is better in terms of performance. And also, in terms of functionality, if you were to swap this out with a separate graphic, you may see a blank image there, which would be nothing more than white space for a moment before you see the overstate. So in terms of how it functions, it will function a lot cleaner using this CSS alternative to something like a JavaScript rollover. So now that we have the buttons in place, we need to continue on. We need to take a look at our monoplate.psd file. The next thing that we need to do is get this placeholder image in here, which we'll use a placeholder image, but if you're working in a real-world situation, you would just reference an actual image. And then we'll also set up these buttons that we have here that would hopefully give you the ability to navigate through several different images that you would have here in this main section. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at in the next couple movies.